When each control rod weighing 350 kilograms began to move up and down, the workers beside the reactor immediately sensed something was wrong. They rushed to warn the control room, but even when the senior engineer pressed the emergency shutdown button, it was still impossible to control what happened next. More fuel was released due to the steam explosion. This caused the reaction that was supposed to handle 3.2 billion watts of power. The figure directly exceeded 33 billion watts. The reactor could no longer withstand the pressure. At 1:23 a.m., it was 1:45. As the reactor exploded, a much larger explosion occurred. Fire. This is considered the worst nuclear power accident in history, and when the accident happened, no one could have imagined. This explosion was a major reason for the Soviet Union's collapse, nor could they imagine. The dose of radiation released by this disaster was more than 400 times that of the atomic bomb in Hiroshima during World War II. What needed to be done now was to extinguish the fire. Without any protective measures, the firefighters thought it was just a simple fire. Little did they know it would cost them their lives. Among them, a firefighter curiously picked up a black object from the ground. He asked his colleague, but no one knew what it was. However, just a few minutes later, his hand, which was fine just moments ago, now became mangled and bloody. In no time, firefighters began to fall one after another, yet the soldiers who did not fall had no thoughts of retreat. They all rushed forward without hesitation. And before the fire spread, the engineers in the control room were completely unaware of the fundamental cause of the explosion. At this moment, a staff member burst in. Everyone fell into a state of unease. As the deputy chief engineer Dia claimed directly, he was stunned with fear. He firmly believed that the core would not explode, but when the staff returned again, after just a few words, the situation escalated. Originally, to eliminate his doubts, at the early report of the staff, Dia wanted to enter the reactor building to see for himself. But when he reached outside and saw the graphite scattered all over the ground in the reactor, he seemed to have realized something. Yet even so, he still ordered his men to proceed as if the reactor was not critical. Additionally, he called the fire department requesting firefighters. Next, they dialed the fire emergency number, requesting firefighters to come and put out the fire, attempting to minimize the losses. Yet these two orders undoubtedly cost the staff aware of the commands and firefighters dearly. Now, with the accident happening, they can only hide in the safe room, needing to report to the plant manager and chief engineer first. But before the report, the plant manager quickly distanced himself. I was just sleeping at home. What actually happened? At this point, Dia also pointed out this plan was approved by the chief engineer. It was executed by several engineers under him. After saying this, he finally began to introduce the accident, but at this moment chose to conceal the new explosion, only saying the water tank explosion destroyed the factory, leading to the roof issue. Subsequently, the plant manager started asking about the radiation situation. Dia claimed it was only 36 rotations per hour. Hearing this, the plant manager breathed a sigh of relief, as evident flames attracted residents from nearby the power plant to watch from the nearby overpass. At that moment, they still didn't know that because of this incident, they would regret it for the rest of their lives. 4 hours later, the fire was still uncontrollable, and the local higher-ups immediately convened a secret meeting. The plant manager reported the work according to the deputy chief engineer's words, stating that if the radiation wasn't significant, if the radiation isn't too severe, how could someone experience vomiting and burns? The higher-ups advised all residents of the town to evacuate immediately. The two sides argued incessantly, but with the sound of the cane, the site fell silent instantly. The elder first asked everyone about the situation. Upon hearing this answer, the elder pointed to the painting hanging on the wall of the safe room and began to crazily brainwash everyone present. Then he uttered a chilling remark. And at the fire scene, the firefighters who fought all night were experiencing severe health problems. Not only were cells damaged by radiation, the bones were gradually dying. And when the immune system failed, the internal organs and soft tissues began to rot. Arteries and blood vessels would also bleed uncontrollably. Even simple pain relief was impossible. After 2 weeks of suffering from illness, all firefighters perished, with none surviving. Due to radiation exposure, their bodies couldn't be handled normally, buried, or preserved. They could only use special sealing materials to seal the coffins. Subsequently, they replaced burials with concrete injections, while the hospital nurses tightly collected the soldiers' clothing, as their skin was damaged by radiation, beginning to ulcerate as the situation escalated. The authorities immediately held a high-level meeting. At the meeting, Professor Legasov proposed, based on the photos from the scene, he deduced that the black substance in the images was graphite. The only place in the nuclear plant where graphite might be found was in the reactor core. That the radiation level at 36 rotations was equivalent to the radiation from 400 chest X-rays, if his speculation was correct. Then at that time, the firefighters were essentially holding stones containing 4 million times the lethal radiation levels. During this time, Legasov also briefly described to the higher-ups the impact of radiation. After hearing what the professor had to say, better safe than sorry, to prevent the situation from escalating to an irreversible point, the official decision was to send Legasov and Energy Minister Shaibina to the accident site to take full command, etc. The two took a plane to the accident site. Just by seeing the scattering of graphite from above, Legasov confirmed his speculation. However, the energy minister insisted on passing through the top to prevent Legasov from getting confused. Though in the end they chose not to go directly through, the energy minister couldn't possibly envision that simply going around nearby would let it live a maximum of 3 to 4 years. When the group arrived at the factory, the command center, the plant manager and his engineers had been waiting for a long time. Yet even at this time, they still chose to continue with a single-minded focus. They presented a list of responsible individuals to have made it to the energy minister's position. How could one possibly trust these small fry? A general under Shibina directly volunteered, driving a vehicle, a larger one, with more manpower directly approaching the fire site, whether to measure or not, who knows. On one side, surprised and startled, after listening to Legasov's report, Shibina directly removed the plant director and engineers from their positions. But the immediate priority was to extinguish. At this moment, an assistant suggested that helicopters could spray water from above, but this idea was soon dismissed by Legasov. This is not an ordinary fire. The only feasible plan at the moment is to use 5,000 tons of tarps and sand. But at this time, the radiation level above the plant was continuously rising, which undoubtedly became another deadly mission. But in a nation of faith, soldiers view obeying orders as their duty. One after another, soldiers piloted helicopters, but due to strong radiation exposure, they kept falling into the deadly chasm. As for the surviving pilots, none lived beyond a year in the end. With the spread of the air, the radiation area grew larger, with weak creatures also starting to die one by one. At that moment, Shibina received a call from the wind. The Swedish nuclear power plant had detected radiation, and the US had also taken satellite images of the accident site. Now the whole world knew, and neighboring countries had already prohibited their citizens from going out. After the news broke, the higher-ups immediately dispatched all buses from nearby towns, starting to evacuate residents near the plant. However, the most ridiculous thing was the American show used a smear tactic, intentionally capturing footage of the first batch of fleeing residents. Among them was the elder who had previously attended the high-level meeting, brainwashing everyone and suggesting to block the news. But just as all the citizens were fleeing for their lives, a contrarian appeared. It turned out that the woman driving was a physicist from a nearby city and research institute, and Rama, after the explosion due to the air spread, caught the metallic taste in the air and quickly conducted tests. When they saw the results, he immediately came over to stop Legasov's foolish behavior. Because blocking the contact between the core and air can extinguish the fire, but the temperature will continue to rise. At this moment, Legasov interrupted everything. It seemed he had known this all along. However, the reactor would breach the ground in a month. At the bottom, lost in confusion, but this would give them time. After Lana's explanation, although the fuel would turn into sludge after a month, Legasov overlooked the water tanks and the reservoirs in the engine control system above the concrete slab, etc. He previously thought the factory had caused the water tank to explode to hide the accident's severity. Little did he know the tanks were still full, so he immediately reported the current situation to the higher-ups. Lana also spoke of the dangers they would soon face. When the lava enters the water tank, the water would instantly overheat and evaporate. 7,000 cubic meters of water would cause a severe thermal explosion. Everything within a 30-kilometer radius would be destroyed, including the remaining 3 reactors of Chernobyl. The massive shockwave would expel all radioactive materials in the reactor core up to about 200 kilometers away. This would directly lead to fatal injuries to everyone in Kiev and its surrounding areas, and the nuclear leak would affect the ecology of all of Ukraine and its neighboring Europe. As for Belarus and Ukraine, it would be completely uninhabitable for at least 100 years. Now, less than 72 hours remain until the tragedy strikes. What needs to be done now is to send 3 workers familiar with the factory's underground structure to manually open the valves and empty all the water from the tank as quickly as possible. But the workers present all knew that going down would be a certain death, yet in the face of national righteousness, they chose to brave the danger. As long as they could save the lives of hundreds of millions, what's death to them? Hearing the 2 names of the reactor core, the 3 men were dressed properly. Even with adequate protection in front of radiation, this was merely to comfort them, trying to reduce their suffering a bit. Although they ultimately completed their mission, they survived and walked out of the plant, but fate did not favor them. Because Legasov told Chernobyl, in a day or 2 their fate would be like that of the previous group of firefighters. But soon new problems arose, even though the thermal explosion crisis had been averted. But the deterioration inside the reactor was worsening faster. After nuclear material melts at high temperatures, it would quickly flow through concrete slabs to the underground nuclear area. As a result, the lives of nearly 50 million people would be affected by radiation due to water quality, including crops and livestock that would be contaminated. They suggested installing heat exchangers beneath the slabs to lower the core temperature and delay the melting rate. The urgent task was to immediately arrange for miners to start work. At first, the miners who received the notice were reluctant, but they had faith, they had responsibility, and upon learning the truth, they were just like the previous trio. If they could save tens of millions of lives, what's the harm in that? In the show, Americans used ironically meaningful images to mock Soviet high grass. The miner brothers stepped forward, leaving one handprint after another, with their dirty hands on the not-so-clean suits. Slowly, not just their clothes, but also their faces were stained with coal dust. When the workers arrived at the accident scene, the referendum learned about the danger level and excavation plan. Without hesitation, they agreed immediately and suggested starting work right away because they knew every wasted second, tens of millions of human lives would be threatened for another second as the digging continued day and night. The deeper the tunnel was dug, the closer they were to the heart, and the temperature kept rising. The attackers went to the general for a large fan, but the general replied, "The fan will kick up dust, which will be inhaled into your lungs if you want to live a bit longer. You have to endure." The workers had no other choice. They could only go in naked. Now, the urgent crisis has been resolved. Next, they must engage in a protracted battle. Due to the effects of nuclear radiation, all residents within a radius of 2,600 square kilometers must be evacuated. Additionally, all plants within a radius of 100 square kilometers, after receiving orders from superiors, must now be completely removed and covered with fresh soil. As for all animals, to prevent the spread of radiation and contamination, they can only be exterminated. Upon hearing the soldiers' whistles, the hungry dogs that hadn't eaten in days excitedly ran towards them, wagging their tails. Yet what they were given was not food, but a bullet. Once all animals were dealt with, the soldiers would gather them together. With concrete barbarously? However, the factory now faced one final challenge, which is that currently the core remains exposed in the air. To cover it, but the scattered graphite on the roof prevents them from getting close. They must find a way to push all the graphite from the roof into the reactor, otherwise anyone who gets near could lose their life. They could only buy a radiation-resistant remote-controlled car from Germany. But it didn't work for long before the powerful radiation caused it to explode. Could it be a quality issue with German products? But upon investigation, it was not. It turned out that Soviet high officials, in order to cover up the severity of the accident, declared to the outside world that the radiation level was only 2,000, resulting in the German-made radiation-resistant car having a maximum capacity of 2,000. The soldiers at the front were in the line of rescue. The higher-ups, however, had their own thoughts. It seems now they could not rely on the remote-controlled car. They had to resort to biological robots again. When soldiers were dragged to the scene one by one, they all put on protective suits, but even with thick layers of lead covering them, each could only work on the roof for 90 seconds, and when time was up, the timer would sound a metal bell, and the workers had to withdraw immediately. Right after, the next pair would take their place. The scattered graphite on the roof was completely cleared in this repetitive cycle. Once all the follow-up work was done, Legasov and Lana, through visits, investigations, and professional evidence, finally understood the real cause of the nuclear explosion. Legasov was invited to attend the international conference, and after the meeting, the high-ranking officials buried their feelings regarding Legasov's statements deeply. They awarded Legasov the title of Hero of the Soviet Union and promoted him to Director of the Research Institute. On the surface, Western countries were also highly critical of Legasov's scapegoating in the conference. Yet major newspapers were filled with mockery. Finally, a Soviet scientist spoke the truth. Although the Chernobyl accident indeed had a connection to the plant manager, the chief engineer, and the deputy chief engineer's violations couldn't be denied. However, behind the explosion, there were actually other engines. It was clear that Legasov was lying. But in the face of national honor, he could only proceed this way. Then, after he had done what he was supposed to do, the Soviet Union did not fulfill its promises to him. Other reactions, such as Lou, remained unchanged. No one discussed the restoration work. At this moment, the high-ranking officials dealt with it nonchalantly. Let's not talk about those for now, until the bad guys are on trial. We'll handle these matters. After returning home, Lana also came knocking. She blamed Legasov for not telling the truth and reproached him for trusting them. Once they initiated the repairs, it would be equivalent to acknowledging the problem. As the world's most advanced nuclear industrial superpower, admitting a problem meant admitting guilt. They would never allow such a thing to happen. Lana requested Legasov to speak the truth in the upcoming trial, insist on industrial reform. But Legasov was clear. Once he stated the facts, not only would he lose his job, but he would also face the death penalty. Even the safety of his family could not be guaranteed. Yet unable to resist Lana's insistence, as she did not want the heroes sacrificed in this incident to die in vain. The trial began. Shcherbina, Legasov, and Lana appeared as witnesses, and the three scapegoats were also pressured to attend. Three scapegoats have also been detained at the scene. Shcherbina was the first to point out that the explosion stemmed from a safety test. The reason for conducting this safety test was to ensure that Chernobyl's Reactor 4 was completed by the end of the year. This way, the plant director and chief engineer, as well as the deputy chief engineer, would all receive bonuses. Now they were just one safety test away. For the sake of honor and rewards, the three even hastily signed off on the plant's completion paperwork. But the next three tests ended in failure. To expedite the testing, the three began to operate outside regulations. Originally, tests were to be conducted during the day, but they insisted on starting immediately. As the experienced engineers had already clocked out for the night, the only ones available were fresh graduates with just 4 months on the job, young engineers with no prior testing experience, and with an older engineer nearby, plus the deputy chief engineer supervising. The young engineer had no choice but to follow the manual. If they had stopped the tests at that moment, none of this would have happened, but because positions were about to be reassigned, If the plant director was moved, the chief engineer would be promoted to director, and the deputy chief engineer would become chief. To ensure the task was completed by the last day of the year and smoothly promote the deputy chief, Dia began urging his staff to speed things up, even issuing commands to operate illegally. To help the jury and judge understand, Legasov conducted a live simulation regarding the Chernobyl accident. You just need to know that two things happened in the reactor. The reaction rate that generates power either increases or decreases. The operator just needs to maintain balance. The fuel is used to increase the rate, while control rods act like brakes, used to lower the reaction rate. The third factor is water. Cooling water absorbs high temperatures in the system, and after forming steam, the rate also increases, but it has a negative temperature coefficient. The higher the nuclear fuel temperature, the lower the reaction rate, meaning that the fuel raises the reaction rate. River water would lower the rate, steam would raise it, and high temperature would lower the rate. It was this set of invisible chain reactions that provided electricity to the city. But to conduct the test, Dia issued incorrect values. This forced the older engineer to assist the young engineer in constantly lowering the power. But when the power dropped to the minimum threshold of 700 megawatt hours, the values inexplicably continued to drop uncontrollably, which frightened the older engineer. Upon hearing this, the deputy chief engineer suspected there was an operational error. However, when the young engineer completed the steps as instructed, the values kept dropping. At this point, the older engineer suggested to immediately shut down the reactor, to wait for 24 hours before retesting, but this idea was rejected by the deputy chief engineer. It had to be done tonight. The deputy chief first pressured them with his years and position, then ordered the older engineer to forcibly increase the power. Refusing to comply would mean they'd have no chance to work in this field again. There was no choice. The older and the younger engineer could only comply. At this point, the deputy chief engineer in court still tried to argue, claiming it had nothing to do with him, that he was in the restroom at the time and had no knowledge of the situation. But such nonsense, even a fool wouldn't believe it. Relevant personnel directly produced the final words of the older engineer, which clearly stated it was the deputy chief engineer's order. To rapidly heat the reactor, Dia ordered the engineers to withdraw nearly all the control rods. This test now served no purpose. At this moment, the computer also suggested to immediately shut down the reaction rate, but Dia didn't care at all. The computer didn't know this was just a test. It only wanted to report to its superiors that it had completed the assigned task. Yet they didn't realize the problems they would face afterward were ones they had never encountered before. Seconds after the control rods were withdrawn, the reaction rate began to rise uncontrollably, and the reactor also started to stir. When the observer ran to report, the older engineer pressed the emergency shutdown button. And it was precisely because of this, the wrong instructions ultimately led to an irreversible accident at the nuclear power plant. And just as Legasov was preparing to continue speaking, the presiding judge interrupted everything because they already knew what Legasov was going to say next. Today, the consequences of the situation have produced results. It was an accident caused by the three men's violations of procedures to achieve their goals. The suggestion in court was to stop here, but at that moment, the energy minister spoke up, allowing Legasov to continue speaking. The presiding judge had no choice but to obey the order, because if it were a machine, everything would be normal. After pressing the emergency shutdown button, all control rods would be fully inserted and the reactor would not explode. To ensure that the sacrifices were not in vain and to prevent similar disasters in the future, Legasov chose to reveal the fundamental cause of the explosion. It was all due to the control rods used to reduce the rate as the state aimed to cut costs. At the tip of the control rods, the boron was replaced with graphite, which meant that when the control rods were inserted, the tip of the graphite would react with other materials. At the time, reactor number 4 would immediately turn into a river. The maximum rate of 3.2 billion watts eventually exceeded 33 billion watts. The situation Lucien could no longer tolerate. Soon the explosion occurred. Everything was because the Soviet Union wanted to save costs. Cutting corners caused it. At this moment, the presiding judge warned him again, but now Legasov could care less about that, because currently there are similar nuclear power plants, more than a dozen in the Soviet Union, each with the same problem. If problems arise again, it could lead to the same outcome. It may even directly destroy the entire Earth's ecology. He didn't want to continue fabricating lies. And after he said all this, unsurprisingly, he was punished. The higher-ups first used unfounded accusations, placing many labels on him. Then they began to announce the arrangements for him by the authorities. Because Legasov publicly presented at the international conference, the state found it inconvenient to execute him. But from today on, he is no longer a hero of the Soviet Union. The state and the court will not recognize anything he said today, because you didn't show up in court today at all. Since that day, she and Shabina Lana never saw you again. And 2 years after the Chernobyl explosion, Legasov died alone in his room. The tape he left behind circulated widely among Soviet scientists. Its suicide had a huge impact. After that, the Soviet government finally admitted its errors, repaired the flaws to prevent another Chernobyl disaster from happening. In fact, historically, there was no person named Lana. Instead, it represented the group of scientists who fought in Chernobyl at that time. At the time, someone rebutted the official records, but in the end, they were mostly reported, arrested, and imprisoned. He was actually paying tribute to those scientists seeking the truth and serving humanity. As for the crab cake, it also died 4 years after the Chernobyl incident. There were also the plant director chief engineer, and deputy chief engineer, who were real people. The three were ultimately sentenced to 10 years in total and returned to the workforce after serving their time. They worked at the Russian Kalinin Nuclear Power Plant. Deputy chief engineer Dyatlov died in 1995. He died of radiation-related diseases at the age of 64. Next up are the firefighters' medical records, still left in the basement of the Pripyat hospital. To this day, the radiation remains at a dangerous level. At that time, the group of people gathering on the bridge reported without a soul living. This bridge is also known as the Bridge of Death. 400 miners dug to prevent melting. They excavated for a month with at least 100 people not living past 40. Over 600,000 people went to serve in the exclusion zone, and although many fell ill and died from radiation, the Soviet government did not have official records. The contaminated zones in Ukraine and Belarus are also known as exclusion zones, eventually covering an area of 300 square kilometers with approximately 300,000 people forced to leave their homes. They were told it was just temporary relocation. To this day, returning home is still prohibited. After Gorbachev took over the Soviet Union, it continued until its dissolution in 1991. In 2006, he wrote, "The honor of Chernobyl might be the real reason behind the USSR's collapse. In Odisha, the new Chernobyl time palace cost nearly $2 billion, preserving it for 100. After the explosion in Ukraine, the cancer rate in Belarus skyrocketed, with the highest increase among children. The true death toll from Chernobyl will forever remain unknown, generally estimated to be between 4,000 and 93,000 people. However, the 31 reported by the Soviet officials have not changed since 1987.